Greetings, this is MBA 522, and we're going to talk about ethical culture and how ethical culture is an important precursor to a good, solid compliance program. So we'll talk about how culture influences the corporate compliance and the ethical nature of the business, and what can we do to monitor our culture to make sure that it is in alignment and doing what we want it to do. So what is an ethical culture? In short, it's the culture of the company, part of the culture of the company that influences the moral judgments of the employees and its stakeholders. And so in this situation, what we want to see in our ethical culture is alignment between what we say we're going to do and ultimately, at the end of the day, what we are actually doing. Companies that have a strong ethical culture make sure that everybody is engaged in honest behaviors and bring integrity to the table, and they are more likely to attract good customers who want to buy their products and services. Ultimately, when we're thinking about culture, there are three parts to it. There's the tone at the top. There's what top management, top leadership says we should be doing. They are walking the talk. They are being the good role models to tell us how we're supposed to behave. And they're doing it in a consistent manner. Then there's what we call the mood at the middle, which is where middle management is trying to navigate between what top management wants and, of course, what the line workers are looking for. And their mood is going to tell us whether or not we're seeing consistency in the behaviors of top management and how that influences our middle managers to be able to support the line people in doing the ethical work the way it needs to be. Where we might start to see our challenges is in that mood in the middle, the middle managers who may not be behaving the way top management wants and may not be holding people accountable and all those things. And then lastly, the last part of ethical culture is what's the buzz going on amongst the people at the bottom? Are you hearing people saying, yes, we want to do this work. Yes, we're going to behave in this certain way. That, do you see people holding each other accountable, or are we much more likely to see them just going and getting away with inappropriate behaviors? So ethical culture exists in this space between what the organization says it values and then what it actually does. And it's the ethical culture that influences that gap so that actually there isn't a gap, that what we value and what we espouse that we value and what we actually do should be in beautiful alignment between the two of them. And it's all in it's all in the responsibility of the ethical culture. The ethical culture drives people's ethical behaviors. And so the culture has to be ethical. The leadership needs to be ethical. The middle management need to be communicating ethical behaviors, and all across the board making sure we are holding people accountable. We know that a good ethical culture is an important precursor to a strong corporate compliance program. So as we get into discussing corporate compliance programs in the next module, you'll start to see why these things are important and need to be there. So we've already talked about culture. Now we're specifically talking about ethical culture. How do we need to think about it? And then how that leads to the compliance programs being doing what they need to do in a way that helps the organization stay ethical. So what are some of the things that are needed to have a good, strong ethical culture? Number one, the top management, as I said, needs to lead by example. If they're going to say we need to behave in a certain way, we need to see them consistently do that. Because even if we think it's not visible or no one will know, people see inconsistencies fairly quickly. So we want to make sure we're consistent in what we do, that we're transparent, that we engender trust from our employees, and that we trust them. It's a two-way street, of course. Number two, we want to communicate clear expectations of what our code of ethics is. And that code of ethics has to be part of those embedded values. And those are the foundations then of that corporate compliance program down the line. So we want to make sure we're incredibly clear about what we want, what is good behavior, what is not good behavior, what would be the accountability or the punishments involved if we don't engage in a certain way. But those expectations in that code of ethics have to be really clear. They can't be vague. They really have to dive into exactly what we expect people to do. Then we need to make sure that we've got some really good components in our ethical training program. It's not a one and done. Ethical training programs have to have seminars. It's good to have good mentors. It's good to have resources where people can talk to each other about these things. We need to have making sure that we've got clarity about what are some sample examples of what an ethical dilemma is, and what are the tools that we want to use to navigate those dilemmas. So ethics training isn't about saying this is right and this is wrong, but it's also about putting people into scenarios and helping them to understand why what they're doing is wrong, but also give them the tools how to think through, reason through these issues. Any good training needs to have reinforcement of those values across the board. So it's not enough for us to say, this is what's ethical, this is what is in the ethics program, this is what we value, and then not have managers reinforce it on the job. So remember when I said it's the mood in the middle. The mood in the middle means that the managers need to make sure that people are continuing to behave in the way that we want them to with respect to ethical norms and ethical behaviors. Then we need to make sure in our reward system that we are reinforcing the behaviors that we want, and we're not reinforcing those behaviors that we don't want. So if we see people doing what we want, we praise them, we encourage them to do it, we might reward them in some manner for doing that. And then if we see behaviors that we don't want to say, well, it's okay, we'll just let it go, because that's a reward in and of itself. If I don't get punished, if I don't get held accountable, that is telling me this is an okay behavior to do. So it is important that we make sure if we're going to say something is inappropriate and we see somebody doing it, we need to hold them accountable for that. And we'll talk about that in the next slide in a few moments. Lastly, a good ethical culture has to have protection for those ethics and ethical whistleblowers. So our whistleblowers are sticking their neck out. They're saying, in an environment that might be very charged, that might be very volatile for them, they're sticking their neck out to say this is inappropriate. So we need to have mechanisms in place to protect them. Now this might be, an 800 number where people can call in anonymously. It could be making sure that they have employment protections, that they're under greater scrutiny for being a whistleblower, so that we ensure that there aren't negative ramifications for them as they do their job. But either way, those protections need to be there for whistleblowers. Besides the fact that it's sort of against the law to fire a whistleblower, it's also really important that we create a mechanism and a culture that protects them from retribution and retaliation, because it's a real thing. Anybody who's already behaving unethical is going to do whatever it takes to continue those behaviors because they're gaining something from it at some level or another. So when we make sure that there is accountability for that, and we make sure there's no retaliation, that continues to protect those whistleblowers. So how do we continue to monitor our ethical culture to make sure it's on the right path and it's doing what we need to do? Some of it can be things that we can ask people, and some of it are things that we absolutely need to do to reinforce the culture the way we want it. And when we monitor our ethical culture, that it encourages us to monitor our compliance programs to make sure they're doing what we want them to do. So number one, we need to make sure we're checking in on the training regularly, that it should be focused and effective. That also means garnering feedback from our employees. Was it useful? Did it help? Are we seeing, as people are more engaged in the training, that they are less likely to have problems with ethical decisions, right? So we can monitor how that training impacts people's behaviors. So that's important. We also want to make sure that the elements that we are using in our training are being followed through on For example, making sure that the managers are enforcing what people learned in the training and they're holding them accountable in a consistent manner. And, in terms of just the monitoring, making sure that what we have in those ethics training programs makes sense. We want to look at fairness and justice in the organization. And that usually happens through our accountability and internal enforcement. But when we are doing a climate survey in the organization or any other sort of assessment of our employees, we can look at how fair and just people feel like the systems are. We can ask them for feedback on what they think the ethical culture is like, whether or not they believe that it's being reinforced appropriately, whether or not they see consistency in people's behaviors, saying what they say and actually following through on behaviors appropriately. But that accountability and internal enforcement, again, as you see, is that in that very bottom point down there, accountability, accountability, accountability. These are key. You're going to learn a little later in this term about team dysfunctions. And one of the biggest challenges in team dysfunctions is, surprise, surprise, accountability. It's being able to stand up to someone in a way to have a difficult conversation, to be able to say to them, this is not working, you're not doing what you said you would do, and we need to get you on the right path to doing it correctly. So in order for us to monitor our ethical culture, we should be looking at whether or not we have an accountability system in place that's reinforcing those behaviors. And on top of that, then, that leads to a good disciplinary procedure. Disciplinary process that has to be fair, that gives everybody due process. We don't want to certainly be in a situation where we're accused of not using due process, but we want to make sure we have a consistent expectations, consistent accountability, consistent way that we treat people regarding how they're being disciplined. And we also want to make sure we're identifying the difference between real ethical culture and what people say they do. Because people can say things all day long, but what we really want to see is not what they say they do, but to actually monitor what they do. And so we can look at that, and it depends on, again, what the issues are in your organization, but we want to be able to really measure the culture, not people saying, oh yeah, I hold people accountable all the time. And it looks great on paper as a checklist, but people actually aren't doing it. So again, going back to accountability, 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 how important it is for us to hold people accountable for behaviors.